Shavua Tov, the creation of man, continues in this week's Torah reading with an incredible story involving three people who are not mentioned by name. I'm talking about the other main story, the Tower of Babel. We'll leave the Great Flood alone until next year. This story involves the power of speech, which is a defining feature of the human being, for it teaches us about how humanity developed different languages. And it also is about the importance of a homeland as humanity was now spread out across the globe. And it starts beautifully. The Torah says that all of humanity spoke one language and said unified things. Great! Such potential! Unity is a wonderful thing, no? And indeed, we see the difference when we compare the consequences of this episode of the Tower to those of the generation of the flood, because back at that time the world was filled with violence. And by the way, the Hebrew word for that violence is, drum roll please, Hamas. The punishment for that was the destruction of humanity, with the exception of Noah and his family. But since this episode of the Tower starts with great unity, the punishment is relatively light. Just start babbling in a different tongue and move to a new area. But wait a minute. Why is there any punishment at all? All of humanity wanted to build a big tower. What's wrong with that? Everybody does that. Been to Dubai or New York lately? Is God coming down and sending everybody over to New Jersey and having them start speaking a new language? Indeed, God implies that this could be great when he himself says, they all speak the same language, yet this is what they have set forth to do. Now they will be able to do anything that they want. In other words, God is saying this unity could be such a blessing. But because the people are corrupting it and using it for a sinful purpose, it could lead to uncontrollable evil. All that about a skyscraper. What am I missing here? So the rabbis of the Talmud understand that this tower was far from innocent. The people wanted to rebel against God. Some say they were going to put a spear at the very top of the tower, primitively believing that God was simply located very high up. Others explained that they were looking to shore up the heavens so that there wouldn't be another flood, so that the skies could never collapse again, as it were. Now, a careful reading of the text will give us a powerful clue into the real evil nature of this tower building project. It's not as simple as we just said. The fact that the Torah prefaces this building with the observation that everybody was saying the same things in the same language indicates that it was that uniformity that provokes them to build the tower in the first place. The tower was to serve that exact uniformity, and there's a difference between unity and uniformity. And here I'd like to invoke the first of our three unnamed participants. He was the ringleader, he was the instigator. His plan was to rule over the world as an absolute dictator from a throne at the very top of this tower. His name was Nimrod, and the name itself means, let us rebel. And he was a powerful king. But he sought one thing that this entire building episode was intended to achieve: complete control. He did not like a God that he could not control. And he assumed that the only reason that the people can't control God is because he's high up. So they built a tower to fight against him, as it were, in his own house. According to the other explanation that they sought to prevent a future flood, they were also trying to exert control and taking God's ability to punish mankind away from him. So Nimrod sought to control God, and he also sought to completely control mankind. The famous Or HaChaim commentary claims that this tower was not just a tall structure, it was intended to be a massive apartment building for all humanity. Everybody would have to live there so that the dictator Nimrod could monitor their activities. Everything that George Orwell wrote in his novel 1984 was Nimrod's goal. So speech was no longer going to be free. No opposition was to be brooked. Nobody could stand up and say, this is wrong, this must not be. And God didn't like it, so he changed all the languages. The second person involved in this episode was really not involved, and that was his tragic involvement. His name was Noah. Yes, Noah was still alive by now, but he was silent. Now these were his children. These were his descendants. Nimrod and everybody came from his lineage, and they were doing this terrible sin. Now, some rabbis interpret the verse about Noah in the beginning of the Parsha, where it states that Noah was righteous in his generations, as a criticism. He was righteous, they say, compared to the state of humanity at that time, but had he lived in a generation of righteous people, he would have been a nobody. Now, that always bothered me, because the Torah says he was a righteous man. The Torah praises his righteousness. Why do these rabbis seek to knock it down? So I don't think that they are criticizing Noah's righteousness. I think they agree that had he been Abraham's next-door neighbor, he would have been even more righteous. But Noah had a tragic flaw. He did not utilize his power of speech. He is the most silent figure in the book of Genesis. He doesn't utter a peep until the episode of Ham after the flood, when he had gotten drunk. That's the only time he ever speaks. So now, as Nimrod proceeds with his evil tower project, Noah's moral voice was deeply needed, but he was silent. And that's exactly what frustrates the rabbis who criticize him, and leads them to say that had he lived in Abraham's time, for example, nobody would have noticed him, not because he wasn't righteous, but because he would have been of no influence. He would have been anonymous because he did not use his speech and remained silent. Which brings us to the third person in this epic. That person is perhaps the trigger for the whole episode, because this was one man that Nimrod could not control, and his name was Abram. He knew how to talk. Later in life, Abraham, as he would be called then, would build altars across the Holy Land and loudly call out upon the name of the Lord. He would teach people about monotheism and bring them close to God's faith. Here was a man who would not be silenced, but Nimrod was going to try. In another episode, recorded by the rabbis, Nimrod had Abram thrown into a fiery furnace because of Abram's denial of the polytheism of the state and insistence on there being one God who could not be controlled. And Abram miraculously emerged from that fire unscathed. So some commentaries, I think of Rabbi Yosef Tzvi Dushinsky, who lived about a century ago, see this entire episode as intended to imprison and silence Abram and install Nimrod as the main influencer or the supreme dictator of all of humanity. That makes sense, especially with the idea of having everybody live in one building. This was not just a building project, it was to be a form of concentration camp. Everybody in one place under the complete control of Nimrod, everybody including and especially Abram. And so God, after changing the languages to ensure free speech, disperses the entire crowd across the world, breaks open the gates, and does not allow one human being to rule and imprison and enslave the entire human race. The first blessing of the silent prayer that we recite 3 times a day concludes with the phrase, "Blessed be God, the shield of Abraham." Why does it conclude with just Abraham and not Isaac and Jacob? I believe it's because we need a generation of Abrahams in order to hasten the redemption, to bring our exile to its conclusion. And it's not an easy task. Raising our voices and proclaiming our faith are critical, but they may not succeed in just one afternoon. The great Rav of Brisk notes that even after God changed the people's languages, he still had to do another step and disperse them, because they were still going to try to build that project even though they were hobbled in their communications. In a similar fashion, when the residents of Sodom had gathered around the house of Lot to demand that he hand over the guests so that they could abuse them, God smites that crowd with blindness. And nonetheless, says the Torah, they continued to try and find the door. So evil and venom don't always give up easily. We need to be Abrahams. We need to be Abrahams all day and all night, continually until the world changes for the good. Shavua Tov.